Hey guys, I just wanted to give kind of a crash course on the main differences between mirrorless and DSLR cameras because this is something that's coming up more and more. I have some friends who want to get into photography and they always say, Derek, should I buy a Canon Rebel or a Nikon? And I'm just like, whoa, wait a minute. There's so many other choices out there depending on what you want to do. Have you considered a mirrorless camera? And they'd say, well, what's that? And then I try to explain it to them and they just kind of look at me like what? So I have here my Panasonic G85, and then over here I have my Pentax K5 IIs, which is what I used to shoot with. And yeah, in this video I'm just kind of going to talk about what makes a mirrorless camera different from a DSLR. DSLR. Mirrorless. So when you look through the viewfinder on a DSLR, light is entering the lens, it strikes a mirror, goes up into the pentaprism, bounces around, and you see it with your eye. And in a mirrorless camera, the light goes in, straight onto the sensor. That information is shown on a display in the viewfinder, and you look at it directly. Now when you take a picture on a DSLR, the mirror goes up and exposes the sensor, the shutter opens. And on a mirrorless camera, the shutter opens and you expose the sensor, so there's no mirror movement on a mirrorless camera, of course. Now this has some advantages. Traditionally speaking, DSLRs have very, very fast autofocus, and the reason for that is they have a dedicated autofocus sensor array down below the mirror. And when you're using the camera, when you're not shooting and the mirror's down, there's actually a little sub-mirror that allows some of the light to go down, and that basically uses your live viewing for the focusing system. Now on mirrorless cameras, and that's called phase detect autofocus, mirrorless cameras now actually offer phase detection pixels right on the sensor. I mean, now even the iPhone has that, so that's something that's being used to close the gap. But typically I'd say autofocus speed. In addition to that, some people just like the way the viewfinder looks on the DSLR, seeing what you would naturally see with your eye. And when you're tracking at super long telephoto distances, that can be nice because you're not getting any lag time whatsoever when you swing your lens around. So, especially when using with telephoto glass, some people really prefer that natural viewfinder. Now, one major advantage with mirrorless, and one thing that draws me to it over DSLR, is autofocus accuracy. And the reason for that is when you're focusing, it's using the sensor for focusing, the very same sensor that's taking your picture. So what can happen on a DSLR, sometimes this focusing system, phase detection, is getting a different distance measurement than what the lens is actually getting. Like, for example, if I put my Tamron 17-50 on my Pentax and I shoot it around 35 millimeters, for some reason this thinks that the actual focus point is about a foot or 2 feet behind what I'm actually focusing on, so when I take the picture it's totally out of focus because my subject was not properly focused. But if I'm on a mirrorless camera and I'm focusing, I'd be able to see that in live view, and there's no mismatch between what the sensor is actually getting in focus and what the autofocus system thinks is in focus, because it's all in the sensor. On a DSLR, you have them split between the sensor, which is actually capturing the image, and then the phase detect autofocus system, which is giving the camera the distance it thinks that you're focusing at. Autofocus accuracy is something that I really like about mirrorless cameras. The next thing, that electronic viewfinder in the dark can actually pick up a lot of things that my eye can't see on a DSLR. If I'm shooting down a really dark hallway inside of a dark building, you know, modern electronics can really amplify that signal coming into that sensor, so you can essentially see in the dark, especially if you have a good f1.4 lens, something that lets a lot of light onto the sensor so it has more to work with. So EVF in the dark, I think, is an advantage of mirrorless cameras. The next thing, I'll say you get true, what you see is what you get WYSIWYG, and that's because what you're getting on your sensor takes all of your exposure variables, your lens parameters, all of that into effect, and there's basically no surprise when you take the shot. Whereas a DSLR, you can have a shot that's like way overexposed or way underexposed, and you have no way of telling because what your eye sees and what the sensor sees are two different things. So this is something I also really like about mirrorless cameras. The ability to magnify your focus point or use focus peaking. Now this is something you can do on a DSLR, but you have to use live view. You cannot do it with the viewfinder because you're not getting, I mean, you cannot magnify in the viewfinder, it is what it is. You're getting the benefits of electronics here. So if I'm shooting with, say, a fast manual prime like my 25mm f.95, I can zoom in the viewfinder and see exactly what I'm focusing on without having to take my camera down, hold it out, and do it like I would on my Pentax. So it just makes the process a lot quicker, I think. Now let's talk about cons of a DSLR. Basically, when you have all these electromechanical things in here, there's basically more to go wrong. There's more moving parts, more gears, more springs. And that can introduce some shock issues. When I say shock, I mean like shutter shock. Mirror slap is a thing, especially on full frame DSLRs. So you have fewer moving parts with the mirrorless camera, you have more moving parts with the DSLR, so you have a more complicated mechanism. One thing that kind of goes along with that is noise. I'll just go ahead and put noise and vibration. Something else, like I mentioned before, you can have some autofocus inaccuracy. Now I should mention, a lot of DSLRs let you fine-tune a lens if you see it's consistently back focusing or front focusing because of this mismatch, the information. You can set it to compensate for that, but the problem with that is if you're using a zoom lens like on my Tamron 17-50 on my Pentax, yeah, it's accurate at 17 and 50, but for some reason at 35 it back focuses like big time. So whenever I'm using that lens, like, oh, I'm shooting at like, you know, 30, 35 millimeters, I better use live view, so I hit the live view button and I use contrast detect autofocus on the sensor so I know that it's going to be getting the right focusing distance. So that's just a quirk that you just have to work around. It's kind of annoying, I think. DSLRs, well, they tend to be much larger and heavier. What's wrong with me today? There has to be a lot of space for all that stuff, and because you have a floppy mirror in here, you have what's called a long flange distance, and the flange distance is essentially the distance between the back of the lens and the sensor. On a mirrorless camera it's quite a bit shorter, so you have to accommodate for all that space. And when you're designing a lens with a shorter flange distance, the lens itself can be smaller. So you can actually say that lenses tend to be larger for the same sensor size on a DSLR than a mirrorless camera, all things being equal. Now the cons of mirrorless, a lot of them center around that viewfinder. Some people just really don't like having an electronic viewfinder. They want to have a natural, completely lag-free experience, even if it means that they don't have the wealth of information you can get with an electronic viewfinder. Doesn't have the gain in dark situations, doesn't have the constant preview, but some people just really like the natural view of a pin and prism optical viewfinder. So I'm just going to say unnatural viewfinder. Another disadvantage is battery life. And the reason for that is, well, just think about it. When you're taking a picture, composing a picture with a mirrorless camera, it's always going to be relaying information to the electronic viewfinder. And on the DSLR, this uses zero power. You can pick up your camera with the power completely off and look through your lens and frame something. So this can be used kind of like a spotting scope with no power whatsoever, whereas a mirrorless camera always has to have power to be able to see what you're doing. And something else, it's something that's not really inherent to the mirrorless design, but it's just something that kind of happens, is what's called focus by wire. What that means is when you focus the lens, you're not actually directly moving the elements that focus it. You're sending a signal from the lens. You're sending a signal from the lens to the camera saying, hey, drive that little focus motor and adjust the focus distance. So it's kind of unnatural, especially for video. You don't have that mechanical coupling. So focus by wire is something that, again, some people really don't like about mirrorless cameras. So here's your DSLR, here's your mirrorless camera. Couple differences you see right off the bat. This is quite a bit smaller and lighter, and this is bigger and heavier. They're both weather sealed, they both have in-body stabilization. So here's your electronic viewfinder on my mirrorless camera. Right away you see that you have all of your information that you would have on your back viewfinder right here. So it's really nice to have all that information at your fingertips. You can quickly get to all your settings and not have to take your camera down. So you learn to kind of just work the buttons with the camera up to your face, and it kind of makes for a really quick and intuitive shooting experience once you kind of figure out where the buttons are and you can just operate them by feel. And here's my DSLR. Got to significantly boost the gain here because it's a much darker viewfinder than the mirrorless camera. So down at the bottom here you see you have your ISO, you have some information, but you don't have anything too rich. You don't have a magnified view, you don't have a histogram, you don't have any kind of live preview of your exposure. You're just getting an optical representation of it. Now I'm going to talk about flange distance. Now, one big advantage of having a short flange distance like on the mirrorless camera on the right is that you can adapt any lens you want and use it with manual focus with no problem. Now, the problem with the DSLR is if you try to adapt any other lens to it, any lens that has a shorter flange distance than what the DSLR itself has, you either lose infinity focus or you have to have an optically correcting element in there, and that degrades the image quality quite a bit. So ultimately why I went with mirrorless over a DSLR is the fact that you get that perfect, what you see is what you get imaging. And I just think in today's day of fast electronics and good viewfinders, that's an advantage overall over an optical viewfinder. Just having all that information available to you when you're looking through the camera, and especially having that autofocus accuracy just being spot on all the time it's something I don't have to worry about now that I did have to worry about before. Something else I like about it, it's small and light, has fewer moving parts, it's quieter. I'll just do a quick shutter sound. I mean, kind of night and day difference, right? So it's smaller, it's less obtrusive, it weighs less, and this could be what you really want. It basically takes the old format and modernizes it around modern electronics, and that's what it comes down to for me. Alright guys, I hope this answered some questions. Thanks for watching.